The wooden floorboards of the hayloft creaked, sounding like a thunderclap in the silence of the barn. Sarah froze, her breath catching in her throat, her hand clutching the small, hand-carved wooden bird deep into her apron pocket. Below her, the heavy boots of her dead father crunched against the gravel. If he found her here? If he found the gift that Caleb had left for her on the boundary fence? The peace of their home would be shattered. She knew that loving a Yoder was not just forbidden. In her father's eyes, it was a betrayal of everything their family stood for. But as she touched the smooth wood of the carving, she knew she could not let go. The morning mist clung to the rolling hills of Holmes County, Ohio, like a soft, woolen blanket that refused to be shaken off. It was late October, and the air held that distinct crispness that promised frost before the week was out. In the Miller household, the day had begun long before the sun had dared to peek over the eastern ridge. The smell of wood smoke and frying cornmeal mush filled the kitchen, a comforting, heavy scent that Sarah Miller had known every day of her 19 years. She moved, with practiced efficiency, her bare feet silent on the linoleum floor as she set the table. The kerosene lamp cast a warm, flickering glow against the white walls, dancing in the reflection of the windowpane. Sarah was a quiet girl, known in the district for her intricate quilting stitches and her ability to calm a skittish horse with nothing but a hum. But beneath her plain dress and her prayer covering, there was a restlessness she could not quite name, a feeling that the world was holding its breath, waiting for something to break. Today was market day. It was not usually a day for excitement, but today the entire community would be gathering in town. The harvest was nearly done, and the mood among the people was one of relief and gratitude. Sarah's dad, Abram Miller, sat at the head of the table, his face weathered and stern, etched with the lines of a man who spent his life battling the earth. He read from the German Bible, his voice a low rumble, thanking God for the health of the herd and the safety of the family. But there was a shadow over the breakfast table, a shadow that had stretched for 10 years. It was the shadow of the boundary line, the creek, that separated the Miller farm from the Yoder farm. Once Abram Miller and Isaac Yoder had been as close as brothers. Now they did not speak. A dispute over water rights during a drought had turned into a bitter silence, a cold war fought with turned backs and averted gazes. Sarah had been told since she was a child, "We do not mix with the Yoder. They walk their path, and we walk ours." The buggy ride to town was bumpy, the rhythmic clip-clop of their horse, Chestnut, the only sound on the dusty road. As they pulled into the market square, the bustle of life took over. Buggies were lined up in neat rows, black and gray against the turning leaves of the maples. Amish men in broad-brimmed straw hats gathered in clusters to discuss milk prices, while women in bonnets of black and dark blue set out jars of apple butter, pickled beets, and intricate quilts. Sarah was assigned to the bakery stall, selling her mother's cinnamon rolls and shoofly pies. She kept her head down, her demeanor modest, handing change to the Englishers' tourists who marveled at the size of the baked goods. It was around noon when the crowd began to thin. Sarah wiped her hands on her apron and looked up, her eyes scanning the crowd. That was when she saw him. Caleb Yoder was loading crates of pumpkins onto a wagon a few stalls down. She hadn't seen him up close in years. The families took great care to avoid one another. He had grown broad-shouldered and tall, his face tanned from the sun, his beard just starting to trim the line of his jaw, signaling he was a baptized member of the church. Now, he was laughing at something a younger boy said, a genuine, open sound that seemed to cut through the noise of the market. As if feeling her gaze, Caleb turned. His eyes, a startlingly clear blue beneath the brim of his hat, locked onto hers. The laughter faded from his face, replaced by a look of intense curiosity, and something else. It wasn't the glare of a feud, it was a question. Sarah felt a flush rise to her cheeks. She knew she should look away. The ordering rules of her heart and the rules of her father dictated that she'll turn her back. But for 3 seconds, she didn't. In the bustle of the market, in the space between two warring families, a silent thread was spun. Winter came early that year, covering the valley in a deep, hushed snow. The work of the farm slowed down. The cows were milked, the wood was chopped, but the long days in the fields were replaced by long evenings by the fire. It was a time for mending harness, for shelling walnuts, and for thinking. For Sarah, the winter provided a strange sort of freedom. The creek that divided the farms froze over, turning the barrier into a bridge. It began with a lost sheep. One of the Millayus had wandered near the creek, getting her leg trapped in a tangle of frozen brambles on the far bank the Yoder side. Sarah had gone out to check the flock, wrapped in her heavy wool shawl. She saw the struggling animal and panicked. To step onto Yoder land was strictly forbidden, but the sheep was bleating pitifully, its breath puffing in the icy air. Sarah gathered her skirts and stepped onto the ice. It held. She scrambled up the snowy bank, her hands numb as she tried to free the animal. The thorns bit into her fingers. Suddenly, a shadow fell over her. She gasped, nearly slipping back onto the ice. It was Caleb. He stood there, holding an axe, his breath visible in the cold. Panic seized her. If he told her father she was trespassing, the anger would be terrible. "Easy," Caleb said, his voice low and gentle. "She's caught tight." He didn't yell. He didn't chase her off. He knelt beside her, his large gloved hands working deftly to cut the brambles away. "Hold her head, Sarah." It was the first time he had spoken her name. It sounded different when he said, "It's so." They worked in silence for a moment, the only sound the snapping of twigs and the wind in the bare trees. When the sheep was free, it bounded back across the ice toward the Miller barn. Sarah stood up, brushing snow from her dress. She knew she should run. "Your dad thinks the ice is too thin to cross," Caleb said, standing up. He wasn't looking at her, but looking out at the frozen creek. "But sometimes you just have to trust it will hold." Sarah looked at him, realizing he wasn't talking about the creek. "The ice is dangerous, Caleb Yoder," she whispered. "Only if you stand still too long," he replied, a small smile playing on his lips. "I carved something. I was going to leave it on the fence post, hoping maybe the wind would blow it to your side." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small object. It was a wren carved from lightwood, smooth and perfect, its wings spread as if in mid-flight. He placed it in her hand. His fingers brushed her palm, warm through the cold air. The contact sent a jolt through her that was more terrifying and wonderful than anything she had ever felt. "Thank you," she breathed. She turned and ran back across the ice, her heart pounding a rhythm that drowned out the winter wind. That was the beginning. Over the next 2 months, the hollow of an old oak tree near the boundary line became their sanctuary. They never met in person again. It was too risky. Instead, they left pieces of themselves in the tree. Sarah left a small jar of her blackberry jam. Caleb left a handful of wintergreen berries. Then came the notes, scraps of paper torn from ledger books, written in the Pennsylvania Dutch dialect they spoke at home. "The sunrise was read today. It made me think of the quilt you won a ribbon for at the fair 3 years ago. I still remember it. See? I pray for peace, not just for the world, but for this valley. My father's heart is hard, but the soil underneath is still good. Is it the same with yours?" As they fell in love, not through touch, but through ink and wood and jam. It was a pure, silent love, growing in the dark of winter like a seed waiting for the sun. Sarah found herself humming as she worked, a lightness in her step that her mother noticed but did not question. But secrets in a close-knit community are like heavy stones carried in a pocket. Eventually, they weigh you down, or they tear the fabric. Spring arrived with a violent thaw. The creek swelled, turning from a bridge of ice back into a barrier of rushing, muddy water. The planting season began, the men guiding their teams of mules across the softening earth. The stress of the season was high. The Miller farm had suffered a poor yield the previous year, and Abram Miller was anxious. He was shorter with his temper, stricter with the ordinance. It was a Tuesday afternoon when the disaster struck. Sarah's younger brother, Levi, only 12 years old, was struggling with a team of young horses near the lower field, dangerously close to the creek. The horses, spooked by a pheasant flushing from the brush, reared up. Levi lost his grip on the reins and was thrown hard against the fence post. Lie, Estil. Sarah was in the vegetable garden, and saw it happen. She screamed, dropping her hoe and running, but the distance was too great. Before she could get there, a figure vaulted over the boundary fence. It was Caleb. He had been plowing the adjacent field. He didn't hesitate. Aaron Tolebi, checking the boy, then calmed the frantic horses with a firm hand. He scooped the boy up in his arms, her brother, a miller, in the arms of a Yoder. Sarah arrived breathless, tears streaming down her face. Is he? He's breathing. Just knocked out, Caleb said, his face pale. We need to get him to the house. Together, they walked up the lane, Caleb carrying the boy, Sarah running alongside. They were halfway to the farmhouse when Abram Miller stepped out onto the porch. He stopped dead. The sight before him, his enemy's son carrying his injured child, his daughter walking beside him, seemed to freeze him in place. Caleb walked right up to the porch and gently laid Levi down on the swing. He was thrown. Abram. He needs a doctor to check his head. Abram Miller's face turned a shade of red that terrified Sarah. He didn't look at his injured son first. He looked at Caleb. "Get off my land," he growled, his voice shaking with a rage that had festered for a decade. "Dead. He helped him," Sarah cried, stepping between them. Levi was hurt. Caleb saved him. "I said get off," Abram shouted, pointing a trembling finger toward the road. "No Yoder sets foot here. We do not need their help. We do not need their hands." Caleb stood tall, meeting the older man's gaze with a respectful but firm look. "I did what any neighbor would do, Abram. I did what Gok would want." He looked at Sarah, a brief, pained glance, and then turned and walked away, his back straight. That night, the house was silent as a tomb. Levi was awake, nursing a headache and a bruised shoulder, but otherwise fine. But the air in the kitchen was thick enough to choke on. Abram sat at the table, the Bible closed in front of him. He looked at Sarah. "I saw how you looked at him," Abram said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You didn't look at him like a stranger. You looked at him like you knew him." Sarah gripped her apron, the memory of the wooden bird in her pocket burning against her leg. "He is a good man. Dead. He is a Yoder." Abram slammed his hand on the table. "They are proud. They are stubborn. They stole water from us when we needed it most. And you? Have you been speaking to him?" Sarah could not lie. To lie was a sin. She looked down at her shoes. "Yes, dead." The silence that followed was worse than the shouting. "You have disobeyed me. You have disobeyed the harmony of this house." Abram stood up, looking old and tired. "From now on, you do not go to the lower fields alone. You do not go to town alone. If I see him near you again, I will go to the bishop. Do you understand? You will bring shame on us all." "I understand," Sarah whispered, tears slipping down her cheeks. But in her heart, a rebellion was taking root. She had seen the kindness in Caleb's eyes, and she had seen the blind hatred in her father's, and for the first time, she questioned who was truly walking the path of God. Summer in Ohio is hot and humid. The corn grew tall, creating walls of green throughout the county. For Sarah, it was a summer of isolation. She was watched constantly. Her mother, usually sympathetic, was frightened by Abram's anger and kept Sarah busy with indoor chores, canning peaches, scrubbing floors, sewing new clothes for the men. Sarah felt like a ghost in her own life. She couldn't go to the hollow tree. She didn't know if Caleb was leaving notes or if he had given up. The uncertainty was a physical pain, an ache in her chest that wouldn't go away. Rumors began to reach the farm through the milk truck driver, the only regular contact they had with the outside news. There was talk that Caleb Yoder was considering leaving, not just the farm, but the community. Rumors said he was looking at carpentry work in Indiana, far away from Holmes County. Sarah's heart shattered. If he left, he would be gone forever. If he moved away, he might find an Amish girl there. Someone without a family feud. Someone he could court openly on Sunday evenings in a buggy. Someone he could marry. One sultry August evening, the humidity broke into a fierce thunderstorm. The sky turned a bruised purple, and the wind whipped the corn flat against the earth. Sarah sat by the window, watching the lightning fork across the sky. She was praying, but her prayers were confused. "Lord, grant me obedience," she tried to say, but her heart said, "Lord, bring him back to me." Her mother came into the room, holding a kerosene lamp. "Sarah," she said softly, "you are pale. You eat nothing." "I am fine, Mongim," Sarah lied. Her mother set the lamp down and sat on the edge of the bed. "Your father, ... He carries a heavy burden. Anger is a heavy stone to carry for 10 years. He thinks he is protecting us. But I see you, daughter. I see where your heart has gone." Sarah looked up, surprised. "You know?" "A mother always knows," she smiled sadly. "Caleb Yoder is a hard worker. I have seen him at the sales. He has kind eyes." She sighed. "But the wall between your father and Isaac Yoder is high. It will take more than a storm to knock it down. He is leaving. Mongvem, they say he is going to Indiana." Her mother took her hand. "If it is God's will, he will stay. If it is God's will, the wall will fall. But you must wait. Patience is the hardest fruit to grow." The storm raged on into the night. Thunder shook the farmhouse, rattling the dishes in the cupboard. Sarah lay in bed, listening to the rain hammer against the tin roof. She closed her eyes and imagined Caleb in his own room across the valley, listening to the same rain. It was the only connection they had left. The morning brought devastation. The storm had not just brought rain. It had brought wind shear. When Sarah looked out the window, she gasped. The great timber frame barn of the Miller farm, the heart of their livelihood, had its roof partially torn off. Shingles littered the yard like fallen leaves. A section of the upper hamow had collapsed. Abram Miller stood in the yard, staring at the ruin. He looked small against the destruction. Without the barn, the hay would rot. Without the hay, the cows would starve in the winter. It was a disaster that could bankrupt them. By mid-morning, the word had spread. In the Amish community, a disaster for one is a call to action for all. Buggies began to arrive, men with tool belts and hammers, women with casseroles and pies. It was a frolic. A work bee, they would rebuild the roof in a day. It was the Amish way. Sarah worked in the kitchen, brewing massive pots of coffee and slicing ham for the midday meal. She watched out the window as the men swarmed the roof like ants. And then she saw the buggy arrive. It was a gray buggy. Isaac Yoder stepped out. He was an older man, stooped and graybearded, and behind him walked Caleb. The chatter in the yard died down. Every man paused in his work. Abram Miller walked slowly toward the gate. The two enemies stood face to face for the first time in 10 years. The air was thick with tension. "We heard about the roof," Isaac Yoder said, his voice rough. "We brought tools." Abram stood stiffly. His pride was battling his necessity. He looked at Isaac. Then he looked at Caleb, who was already holding a bundle of shingles, ready to work. "We have enough hands," Abram said stiffly. "You have a hole in your roof?" "Abram," Isaac said, gesturing to the barn. "And rain is coming again tonight. You need neighbors." Abram hesitated. He looked at the destroyed barn. He looked at his neighbors watching him. Then he looked at Caleb. He saw the young man who had carried his son. He saw the young man who had refused to shout back. "The ladder is on the south side," Abram said gruffly. It wasn't an apology, but it was an acceptance. The tension broke. The men went to work. Caleb climbed to the highest, most dangerous peak of the roof. He worked tirelessly, stripping damaged wood, hammering new beams. Sarah watched him from the kitchen window, her heart swelling with pride and terror as he balanced on the ridge. At noon, the women served lunch on long tables set up in the yard. Sarah was pouring lemonade. She reached the end of the table where Caleb was sitting. He looked up, his face streaked with sweat and dust. "You didn't go to Indiana," she whispered, pouring his drink. "No," he said softly, so only she could hear. "I couldn't leave. Not while my heart was here. my da ed ... He is stubborn. He is, Caleb agreed. But the roof is getting fixed. And maybe, just maybe, the fence is getting lower. The turning point came late in the afternoon. A heavy beam slipped from a hoist. It swung wildly, heading straight for Abram Miller, who was distracted on the scaffolding. "Look out!" Caleb shouted. He didn't think. He threw himself across the scaffolding, shoving Abram out of the way. The beam slammed into Caleb's shoulder, knocking him down hard against the planks. There was a collective gasp. Silence fell over the yard. Abram, shaken but unharmed, crawled over to Caleb. "Boy, you all right?" Caleb grimaced, clutching his shoulder. I think it's just a bruise. It didn't break." Abram stared at him. He looked at the heavy beam that would have surely cracked his own skull. He looked at the son of his enemy, who had now saved 2 members of his family. The years of anger, the petty dispute over water, the pride, all seemed so small in the face of life and death. Abram reached out a hand, not to check the injury, but to help Caleb up. He gripped Caleb's good arm and pulled him to his feet. "You have a strong arm, Caleb Yoder," Abram said, his voice loud enough for the others to hear. "And a good eye." He paused, swallowing his pride. "Thank you." Isaac Yoder had climbed up the ladder. He stood next to Abram. The 2 old men looked at each other. "The water runs where God wills it, Abram," Isaac said quietly. "We have been fools to try and dam it up." Abram nodded slowly. "We have been fools." He turned to the crowd below. "Let's finish this roof." 2 years later, the autumn leaves were burning with color again, red, gold, and orange covering the hills. The boundary fence between the Miller and Yoder farms was still there, but a gate had been installed. A gate that was never locked. Sarah sat on the porch of a small dotty house. A small house for grandparents or newlyweds built on the edge of the property. She was quilting, the needle flashing in the sunlight. The pattern was the double wedding ring. The screen door opened and Caleb stepped out, holding a mug of coffee. He sat beside her, resting his hand on her knee. They didn't need to say much. The silence between them was no longer filled with longing and fear. It was filled with peace. Down by the creek, a child was laughing. It was their son, toddling toward the water on unsteady legs. "Careful near the water," Caleb called out gently. "He is fearless." "Like his father," Sarah smiled, tying off a thread. "And stubborn, like his grandfather," Caleb laughed. They looked down the lane. Abram Miller and Isaac Yoder were walking together near the pasture, inspecting a new foal. They were walking slowly, talking. Their old dispute, buried under seasons of forgiveness and the reality of a shared grandchild. Sarah rested her head on Caleb's shoulder. The letter she had once hidden in her pocket was long gone, but the promise it held had come true. They had learned that faith was not just about following the rules or keeping the order. Faith was about knowing when to build a wall and when to build a gate. The sun dipped below the hills, bathing the valley in golden light. The harvest was in. The barn was full, and the boundary line was just a line on a map, erased by the footsteps of a family made whole.